The Milwaukee Leader from the end of November 1927 brought us a poem. For several things like this one, we have fortunate luck to thank. We go every day to a regular job, a regular part of a virtuous mob, and we don't have to rob a bank. Fittingly for Thanksgiving, the Brownsville Herald ran a story at the end of the month titled "Alleged Coiners Kidnap Two Girls." Counterfeit money was traced from Miami, Florida, north through Georgia and Tennessee, west to Little Rock, Arkansas, and then back south through Baton Rouge down to New Orleans, Louisiana. A separate Associated Press article written 4 days earlier noted that Jesse Herman Smith had been arrested in New Orleans, Louisiana, making him the fourth captured of an alleged 5-member gang of counterfeiters. Smith was also facing charges for violating the Mann Act for taking the girls across state lines. Smith was arrested along with Linwood A. Collins, 32, of New Orleans, as they entered an apartment in a nice part of town. Now, this is where it gets odd. Cecilia Beatty, 15, and Betty Donaldson, 20, both of Atlanta, Georgia, claimed they were kept prisoner under the threat of death since they arrived in New Orleans 3 days earlier. Cecilia was able to slip out of the apartment when Smith forgot to lock them in. She wired her father, M.E. Beatty, in Atlanta, who in turn wired justice agents in New Orleans who arrived shortly thereafter for the rescue. Well, apparently Smith and Collins put up a furious fight, but were eventually subdued and were discovered to be carrying 4 pistols in a package they were carrying. Shreveport, Louisiana officers were notified to watch for an E.R. Ross, an alleged Confederate of Smith's. They learned that Ross was heading to New Orleans from Dallas, Texas. Now, the girls claimed that they were held by Smith and Ross since November 8th, when they accepted an automobile ride in Atlanta. They said the men did holdups in Nashville, Tennessee, Little Rock, Arkansas, and New Orleans, Louisiana, along with several robberies in Atlanta. A sign of the time that you might think is from 2025, but it's actually from November of 1927 from the Milwaukee Leader. Launch nationwide campaign on drug traffic. Plan new laws. Indeed, the Washington Times ran an article titled "Finds Heroin Drives Youth into Crime." Snow parties or sniffing heroin were becoming common, and that robberies throughout the country had increased 84% since a heroin wave began 10 years earlier. Meanwhile, the Imperial Valley Press covered a story about a search for a lone bandit after he performed a daylight holdup of the Sunset Boulevard branch of the California Bank and escaped with around $5,000. A day later, we get some resolution with bank robber shot by police, fights for life. J.W. Walton, known as Lone Wolf Walton, 29, formerly of Dallas, Texas, was shot by 2 bullets in the abdomen. He was then, quote, fighting for his life in a police hospital, end quote, in Los Angeles, California, after being captured on the evening of November 16th. So 4 detectives hid in the apartment. When he opened the door, he was confronted by the detectives, but Walton refused to surrender, making a, quote, dash for a window, end quote. The detectives opened fire and Walton fell. Well, he was alert enough to ask that his wife be notified and gave her address in Dallas, Texas. Meanwhile, another woman, Mrs. Eloise Clark Popping, 23, had been taken into custody. Police wanted to question her regarding Walton's activities because they were aware that Popping had been associated in some form or fashion with Walton since Mr. Popping left for Kansas City a few weeks earlier. The Manning Times, I believe this is the first time we're using this newspaper, ran a story, "Arrest Fowlers in Bank Robbery." A.J. Fowler, Jr., a Florence, South Carolina lawyer, and his father, a supervisor on the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, had been arrested on November 15th. They were implicated in a holdup that took place in March of the Bank of Coward. A signed confession by a Thad Smith implicated the Fowlers, and Smith was then serving 16 to 20 years in the South Carolina State Penitentiary for manslaughter. The confession stated that Smith and Carl Fowler, that's AJ's brother, had robbed the bank and eventually gave part of the proceeds to AJ, the lawyer, and their father. Smith stated that he and Carl Fowler had scoped out the bank a week before the heist. They removed the license tag from the rear of their car, blocked off the windows so no one could see inside, and left the car outside the bank with the motor running. Fowler entered the bank and drew a pistol, pointing it at the cashier. He ordered everybody to, quote, stick 'em up, end quote, and they escaped with that $5,000 in loot. They then hid out in the woods for a few days and split up the take from the heist. Smith claimed he got about $1,900, which he took to Great Falls, Montana in an old satchel, until AJ Fowler, the lawyer, had Smith turn the money over to him. Well, two unmasked bandits held up the Scott County Bank in Morley, Missouri, again at $5,000. They entered the bank with guns leveled at L.L. Hunter, the cashier, and two other unidentified people, either patrons or employees. They got into a getaway car that had a woman at the wheel. The South Bend News-Times helps us follow up on the Berger gang story with posses begin search for Berger gangster. Deputy sheriffs and posses composed of farmers and businessmen searched the roads and the woods between Marion, Illinois and St. Louis, Missouri. They were searching for Harvey Dungy, former Charlie Berger gang member who'd escaped the Williamson County Jail along with another prisoner named James Watson. Dungy literally sawed through the walls of his cell with a hacksaw and lowered himself out of his cell. Well, he'd been transported from the Chester State Penitentiary to face a charge of having murdered Lyle Worsham of Ziegler, Illinois, who was another alleged gangster. We've covered the Berger gang and its war with the Shelton brothers in southern Illinois several times, and for an introduction, check out the Bloody Williamson and the Tri-State Terror video. And we turn for the first time to the Batesville Guard and a follow-up story on a robbery that took place in St. Joe, Arkansas. Searcy County grand jury indicted Russell Nichols on 3 counts after he confessed to participating in the St. Joe bank heist that occurred in October and was covered in the Gangsters Gamble on Greed video. The robbers scored about $1,700, but seriously wounded St. Joe merchant W.L. Henley. Nichols, only 19, was arrested a few days after the robbery at the home of Bess Love. Bess Love was the sister of Troy Love, the escaped convict who was also involved in the bank heist. Bess and her sister Elizada Love had been in jail until the afternoon of November 23rd, when they were released after appearing at the grand jury hearing. Andrew, Olin, and Bill Love, the father, brother, and uncle of Troy Love respectively, were still being held in jail and were set to appear in front of the grand jury on November 24th. All 3 of the men were being held as adjacent accomplices to that robbery. The Paris Express, another paper I believe we're using for the first time, ran a story, Bandits Hold Up Van Buren Bank. 3 unmasked men, quote, 2 of whom are white and the other believed to be an Indian, end quote, robbed the First National Bank of Van Buren, Arkansas, and escaped with a very specific $3,222 in currency. Dale Miller, cashier, was seated at his desk when the robbers entered and was forced toward the rear office and the vault. However, Miller, quote, darted down a stair to the basement, and, quote, from which he escaped through a basement window and raised the alarm. The robbers exited a side door and got into a Chevrolet Touring getaway car that had a man at the wheel. John Emery and Alan Taylor, along with Steve Marshall, quote, an Indian, end quote, were in the Crawford County Jail at Van Buren, Arkansas, charged with the robbery of the First National Bank of Van Buren. John Taylor was arrested at Tulsa by Tulsa police in possession of a touring car. Police said he had almost $2,300 in a rooming house when he was arrested. John, or Johnny Taylor, 26, apparently made a statement confessing his part in the heist. 5 robbers loot bank, get $30,000. Lock Marshall and car, safe is blown open. 5 men robbed the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Bearden, Arkansas, and scored that $30,000 in currency and Liberty bonds earlier in the day on November 26th. They, quote, seized the marshal, Tom Pierce, end quote, while he was making his rounds after midnight. Pierce was initially locked in a warehouse, then moved to the back room of the bank, and finally to a refrigerated boxcar with another man named Pete Culp. Then the robbers went into the bank and they worked with an acetylene torch to open the safe, blew open the safe, and escaped in a car bearing a Texas tag or plate, scoring $30,000. Marshall Pierce was freed by a passerby about 6 a.m. that morning, after which he immediately organized a posse to search for the robbers. The Washington Times helps us follow up on the Pawtucket, Rhode Island hideout and post office robbery story with Red Savage gives up in big mail robbery. George Red Savage was considered the brains of the, quote, notorious Pawtucket post office robbery, end quote, that took place back in February of 1926. That robbery netted $260,000 in stamps and postal funds and was the largest robbery in the history of the post office department at that time. We introduced this story in a February 26th video titled Killer Couples, a robbery between friends and a guilty farmer. The South Bend News-Times ran a regular column titled McIntyre on Broadway. There was a, quote, frustrated holdup of a Harlem bank, end quote, resulting from a tip-off by a stool pigeon. The heist was going to be done by 2 carloads of robbers who were going to disguise themselves as, quote, motion picture players, cameramen, a director, end quote, and others to give the idea that they were going to use the bank to film a movie holdup scene. They even had fake letters of introduction from a film executive. Police officers even helped keep the gawking public at bay. Then the robbers attempted or actually held up the bank. I'm not even sure if this really happened or if this was more of a creation. Bank bandit makes away with $25,000 in loot. A lone bandit robbed a post office clerk of a registered bag containing between $25,000 and $30,000 that had been intended for the Birdsboro, Pennsylvania bank. He was chased into the Chestnut Hills of Chester County afterwards by local and state police. The clerk, Webster Evans, was struck down when a stranger pulled his touring car to the curb and called for Evans by name. The driver then stepped out and struck Evans in the head, grabbed the bag, and took off in his automobile. We turn to the Chicago Whip for the first time, and soot-faced bandit steals $20,000. The solitary bandit who robbed the bank clerk covered his face with soot. He was later identified as Frank Glass, a bookkeeper at an area ice plant. All the money except for $5,000 was recovered. Glass had been forced to abandon his bullet-ridden car after a 10-mile pursuit by a posse. He abandoned ship, but he was surrounded and arrested a few hours later. He was examined closely and, quote, The first impression that the bandit was colored was completely discredited, end quote. The Evening Star helps us follow up again on Richard Reese Whitmore, or at least a connection to him, in Suspect Loses Appeal. Nathan Weinzimmer, alleged to be, quote, the last of the famous Whitmore gang of robbers, end quote, was going to stand trial in New York for his part in a diamond robbery that occurred there in January of 1927. We touched on the Candy Kid, Richard Reese Whitmore, initially in the video, The Candy Kid, Yeggs in Boston and New Jersey, and another nickname Blackie, in an April 1926 video, and a handful of times since. But his name keeps coming up. A November 10th story by the Evening Star had yet another connection to Whitmore. Gangman thwarted in plot to escape. A plot by a group of long-term prisoners, all members of the defunct Richard Reese Whitmore gang of thieves, was thwarted on November 10th. They had hoped to escape the Dannemore State Prison in Clinton, New York. The prisoner who gave the tip, or, quote, the squealer, end quote, was stabbed in the exercise yard with a knife fashioned out of a spoon. 6 pistols, 200 rounds of ammunition, 6 bottles of liquor, and several road maps of the Adirondack Mountains where the prison was located were uncovered in the receiving room of the prison. Following that discovery, extra guards were stationed and numerous prisoners were transferred, especially after that plot had been uncovered. The South Bend News-Times had their political cartoon titled, Ain't We Got Fun? What appears to be an upper crust man peers over a wall. He sees a stereotypical burglar or robber identified as Night Prowling Bandit. The robber is dancing with a smaller, more innocent figure identified as Shorter Daylight Hours. Daylight savings, or changing the clocks one way or the other, an idea that's been hated, apparently, since at least 1927. Next Saturday, we hone our focus down to Indiana once again for bank robberies, embezzlement, counterfeiting, follow-ups on old robberies, and more.